Picture a man sitting in his apartment on a Saturday night. No plans, no text coming in. And the wildest part? He's completely fine with it. Not lonely, not bitter. Actually, content. Maybe even relieved. 3 years ago, that same man would have called a woman just to fill that silence. Any woman. He would have made plans he didn't want. Had conversations that drained him. Smiled through dinners where he felt more alone than he ever did by himself. Something shifted. And what shifted wasn't his feelings toward women. It was his understanding of himself, and how that understanding permanently changed the way he sees everything, including relationships. Welcome to Brutal Relationship. We don't sugarcoat how human connection actually works. We pull back the curtain on the psychology most people would rather not look at. Now, here's the conversation nobody is having. When a man spends real substantial time living alone, not just a few months between relationships, but actual years, something happens inside his psychology that most relationship advice completely ignores. His baseline changes, his filters sharpen, and the way he interprets women, attraction, and connection starts running on entirely different software than it used to. This isn't a story about men becoming cold. It's not a story about giving up or going emotionally numb. It's actually much more interesting than that. The first thing solitude does to a man is strip away distraction, and that sounds peaceful. But honestly, the first phase of real aloneness is uncomfortable in a way most men are completely unprepared for. Here's what most people miss. When a man is constantly moving between relationships, social events, and the presence of others, he never has to sit with his own thoughts long enough to hear what they're actually saying. He's running from something without knowing he's running. Think of Marcus. Mid-30s, decent job, never single for more than 2 months at a time. Every time a relationship ended, he'd be back on apps within the week. Not because he was heartless, but because the silence scared him. He didn't recognize that fear. He just called it moving on. Then he had a stretch of 18 months where things just didn't connect with anyone. No dramatic decision to be alone. Life just played out that way. And somewhere around month 7, something cracked open. He started noticing patterns in his past relationships that he had never let himself see. He realized he had consistently chosen women who kept him emotionally activated. Not necessarily happy, but activated. There's a difference. Anxiety feels like chemistry when you've never learned to sit in peace. Think about that for a second. Let it actually land. What he had mistaken for passion was actually familiarity with chaos. He grew up in a house where love came with tension. So, tension felt like love. Peace felt like indifference. Solitude taught him the difference, and once you know that difference, you cannot unknow it. So, what do you do with this? If you're a man who has never spent real time alone between relationships, your type might not actually be your type. It might be a trauma pattern wearing attractive clothing. The practical move is to get quiet. Not forever, not dramatically, but long enough to hear what's underneath your instincts. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this next shift is one most men won't admit to. When a man lives alone long enough, he stops performing. And I mean that in the most specific way possible. He stops performing strength. He stops performing interest he doesn't feel. He stops performing enthusiasm about things he's neutral about just to be agreeable. Why does this happen? Because performance is exhausting, and when there's no audience, you stop doing it. Sounds obvious. But the problem is that most men didn't realize how much they were performing in the first place until they stopped. Take a guy like Daniel. Quiet, thoughtful, spent 2 years living solo after a long-term relationship ended in his late 20s. During those 2 years, he did something he had never really done. He noticed what he actually found interesting, not what he performed interest in to match someone else's energy, not what he pretended to care about because she cared about it. What actually lit him up. And then, when he started dating again, something bizarre happened. He found himself genuinely, almost stubbornly, unable to fake enthusiasm. If a conversation was flat, he couldn't manufacture electricity. If the chemistry wasn't real, he couldn't perform it into existence. Some people would call that a problem. He called it clarity. Here's the psychological mechanism underneath this. Performance in relationships is often rooted in a fear of not being enough. A man performs because some part of him believes that the authentic, unspectacular reality of who he is won't hold someone's interest. Solitude, over. Time confronts that fear directly. You sit with yourself long enough, and you either decide you're acceptable or you do the work to become someone you respect. Either way, the performance loses its justification. What this means practically, and this is something almost no one talks about, is that a man who has lived alone long enough often comes across differently when he dates. He's not trying to impress. He's not over-explaining himself. He's just present, genuinely present. And that quality is magnetic in a way that performed confidence never quite is. So, what do? If you catch yourself constantly performing in early conversations, laughing louder than you feel, pretending to be more okay than you are, agreeing to avoid friction, that's not charm. That's a mask. And masks are exhausting to maintain. Real connection doesn't need them. This next section is where things get a little more psychologically dense. But stay with me because this is the part that genuinely changes how men interact with women. A man who has spent significant time alone starts developing something that's hard to name exactly. Call it pattern recognition in relationships. He stops seeing individual interactions and starts seeing the dynamics that shape them. Here's a concrete example. A man who has never been alone tends to evaluate a woman primarily on how she makes him feel in the moment. Is she beautiful? Is she interesting? Is she into me? These are all valid questions, but they're only half the picture. A man who has spent years alone and done genuine self-reflection starts asking different questions. Not better in a condescending way, just different in scope. He's asking, what dynamic does this create between us? When I'm around her, do I become more or less myself? Does the way she communicates match what I actually need? Or does it mirror a pattern I've been trying to escape? Think about that shift. He's moved from, does she excite me, to, does this work? There's a name for what solitude builds here. It's called earned self-knowledge. The kind of self-awareness that only develops when you've had to sit with the full weight of your own patterns without anyone else to blame. But here's the shadow side of this. And I want to be straight with you because this is real. Sometimes this pattern recognition becomes over-analysis. Some men who have been alone for long stretches start intellectualizing attraction to the point where they talk themselves out of genuine connections. They see the dynamic so clearly that they preemptively disqualify people before the story has a chance to unfold. That's not wisdom. That's armor pretending to be wisdom. So what do? The balance is to let the pattern recognition inform you without letting it replace experience. You can notice something without it being a deal breaker. You can be aware of a dynamic without exiting before it's had a chance to develop. Self-knowledge should expand your capacity for connection, not shrink it. Here's the thing that outsiders almost always get wrong about men who live alone for extended periods. They assume the man is sad about it, that he's settling, that he's given up. And in the early stages, sometimes that's true. Real talk. The first phase of extended solitude for a lot of men does involve a version of grief. Grief for relationships that ended, for versions of themselves they thought they'd be by now, for a life that looks different than the one they imagined. But something that most people never see from the outside is what happens after that grief moves through. Because grief is not a wall, it's a door. Meet someone like Theo. 41. Divorced in his mid-30s after a 12-year relationship that had gone emotionally hollow years before it officially ended. He spent 3 years genuinely alone, not dating, not distracted, not numbing out. He called it the hardest and most necessary thing he ever did. What happened on the other side surprised him. He stopped being afraid of loneliness. And when you stop being afraid of loneliness, your entire relationship with intimacy changes. Think about this carefully. Most people, not just men, but most people, enter relationships running from aloneness. The relationship becomes a refuge from a feeling they can't tolerate. And when a relationship is primarily a refuge from a feeling, it becomes load-bearing in ways no relationship should be. The other person is no longer just a person. They're a solution to an internal problem. And that pressure, invisible but constant, distorts everything. A man who has made peace with his own solitude doesn't need a relationship in the same desperate way. And here's what's counterintuitive about that. He often becomes far more capable of genuine intimacy, not less. Because he can be fully present in a connection without gripping it in fear. He can love without needing, and that distinction is enormous. So what do you do? If loneliness feels unbearable to you right now, the instinct is to fill it fast. But the better move, harder but better, is to ask what the loneliness is pointing at. What part of your internal life has been outsourced to other people that you actually need to build for yourself? Companionship can coexist with wholeness. It just shouldn't be a substitute for it. This might be the most important shift of all, and it's the one most men resist acknowledging directly because it requires admitting something unflattering. Before extended solitude, many men, not all but many, don't really see women as whole people in the way that phrase genuinely demands. They see projections. They see what they need the woman to be. They see their mother's warmth, or their ex's passion, or the emotional safety they never had as a kid. This isn't malicious. It's not even conscious most of the time. It's a fundamental feature of human psychology. We see others through the lens of our own, unresolved interior landscape. But here's what solitude does. When you have no one else to project onto, you start to see those projections clearly. You start to notice the gap between who you were actually with and who you believed you were with. A guy named James once described it to a friend this way. He said that after 2 years alone, he looked back at his last serious relationship and realized he had spent most of it in love with an idea he had built around a real woman. The real woman was showing him who she was the whole time. He just kept choosing the idea instead. Painful, but also, once you see it, genuinely liberating. Because here's what changes when you stop projecting and start actually seeing. Women become interesting in a way they never quite were before. Not just romantically interesting, actually interesting. As people with their own contradictions and history and blind spots and growth edges and humor and darkness. The man who has done the internal work through solitude can sit across from a woman and be genuinely curious about her actual reality. Not the story he's writing about her, not what she represents. Her. Who she actually is when she's not being evaluated. When she's in the middle of figuring something out. When she's scared. When she's at her most real. That quality of attention is rare. And women can feel the difference between being seen and being assessed. So, what do? Start paying attention to the gap between your expectations walking into a connection and what you're actually encountering. When you feel disproportionately disappointed by someone, ask yourself, were you disappointed by her or by the distance between reality and the story you were already writing? That's not a rhetorical question. Actually, sit with it. There's one final shift that happens in a man who has been alone long enough, and it might be the hardest one to articulate. But I want to try because it changes everything about how he moves. Forward. He stops choosing from lack, and he starts choosing from desire. Those sound similar. They are actually completely opposite. Choosing from lack means, I don't want to be alone, so I'll invest in this connection and hope it becomes what I need. Choosing from desire means, I am complete whether or not this develops into anything. And I am choosing to move toward this because something in me genuinely wants to explore it. The internal experience of these two things is night and day. The first is tinged with anxiety, the second feels like freedom. A man who has lived alone long enough, who has done the uncomfortable internal excavation that solitude demands, naturally starts operating from the second place. Not because he becomes invulnerable, not because he stops wanting love or companionship. He wants those things, but he wants them from a place of genuine desire, not from fear of their absence. And something almost paradoxical happens when he shows up that way. He becomes genuinely less anxious in romantic contexts, less reactive when things don't move the way he hoped, less prone to that particular desperation that turns promising connections into pressure-filled performances. The woman he eventually chooses feels chosen. Really chosen, not needed. There's a difference. Being needed can feel flattering for a while. Being genuinely chosen by a man who is whole and present and not running from his own silence feels like something different entirely. Here's what I want to leave you with. Extended solitude is not a consolation prize for men who can't connect. When it's used honestly, when a man doesn't just physically live alone but actually goes inward, it produces something that no relationship can produce on someone else's behalf. It produces a man who has met himself, who has been uncomfortable with himself and stayed anyway, who has grieved and felt and sat in silence and come out on the other side, knowing the difference between peace and emptiness. And that man sees women differently, not with cynicism, not with distance, with clarity, with real curiosity, with the kind of presence that only becomes available when you're no longer running. The question isn't whether you can build something real with another person. The question is whether you've built something real with yourself first, because that's the foundation everything else stands on, and no amount of the right person can substitute for building it.